Welcome to Café Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. Today we're joining the brilliant Belgian detective Hercule Poirot in a captivating seaside investigation with the paper Swan murders. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's ease into it. The paper Swan Murders. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Holiday. I have always found that there is something irresistibly soothing about the English coastline in autumn. The summer crowds have departed, leaving behind a pleasant tranquillity that allows one to properly appreciate nature's splendour without the distraction of ice cream vendors and sunburnt tourists. It was with this anticipation of peaceful solitude that I returned to England from Argentina in late September, expecting nothing more taxing than perhaps a spot of fishing and catching up with old acquaintances. Little did I suspect that within 48 hours of my arrival in London, I would find myself embroiled in one of Poirot's most perplexing cases. I had scarcely settled into my club when I received a telephone call from my old friend. His voice, with its distinctive foreign intonation, brought an immediate smile to my face. "Hastings, mon ami, you have returned to England and did not inform Poirot immediately. This is most distressing." "My dear fellow," I replied, "I only stepped off the boat yesterday. How on earth did you know I was back?" "Ah, that is simple. I encountered your good friend Colonel Marchbanks at Simpson's. He mentioned with much enthusiasm that you were expected, so I said to myself, 'Poirot, you must telephone the club where Hastings always stays.' And voilà, you are there." I chuckled at his triumphant tone. "Well, I was planning to call on you tomorrow. I've taken lodgings near St. James's Park for a month or so." "No, this will not do," he declared with characteristic decisiveness. "You will cancel these arrangements immediately. I require your assistance, Hastings. There is a matter, a most singular matter, which may interest you." His words piqued my curiosity. "A case, Poirot?" "Precisely. I have been summoned to a place called Limehaven. It is a small town on the south coast. The chief constable there, he is an old acquaintance who once benefited from my expertise in Brussels many years ago. He has telegraphed me regarding a most troubling murder." "Murder?" I echoed, my peaceful holiday plans rapidly evaporating. "Indeed, a woman, a widow named Eleanor Blackwood, has been found dead in circumstances most puzzling. The local police are, as you English say, at their wits' end." He paused dramatically. "And there is a most curious detail, Hastings." Beside the body was placed a small swan exquisitely crafted from paper. "A paper swan? How extraordinary!" "Is it not? I depart for Limehaven on the afternoon train. You will accompany me, yes." Within hours I found myself seated opposite Poirot in a first-class carriage, watching the London suburbs give way to rolling countryside. My friend, immaculate as always in a perfectly pressed suit, was absorbed in a small leather-bound notebook. His egg-shaped head occasionally nodded as though confirming some private theory. "Tell me more about this case," I ventured, as our train rattled southward. Poirot closed his notebook with precision. "The facts as presented to me are these. Madame Blackwood, a widow of some 45 years, was discovered yesterday morning by her maid. She had been strangled, most efficiently according to the police surgeon, in her sitting room. The door and windows were locked from within, yet there was no sign of forced entry." "A locked room mystery," I exclaimed, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. "Not quite, mon ami. The French windows that open onto the garden terrace were unlocked, though the maid insists they were secured the previous evening." "And this paper swan, what do you make of it?" Poirot's fingers caressed his immaculate moustache. "At present, nothing. It is an item of interest, certainly. The inspector in charge, a man named Finch, believes it to be some form of signature. The criminal's calling card, perhaps. The seaside town of Limehaven proved to be a picturesque place nestled between imposing chalk cliffs. The Grand Atlantic Hotel, where reservations had been made for us, overlooked the harbour and offered a commanding view of the churning sea below. No sooner had we checked in than Inspector Finch appeared in the lobby, a tall, weathered man with the ruddy complexion of one who has spent considerable time exposed to the elements. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending a large hand, "I cannot express how grateful we are for your assistance. This business has thrown the entire town into disarray." After introductions were made, Finch led us to a small, private sitting room where he proceeded to outline the case in greater detail. Mrs. Blackwood was well liked in the community, active in local charities, no enemies that anyone can identify, widowed for 12 years, comfortable but not wealthy, lived alone except for a maid who does not reside on the premises. "The method of the crime?" Poirot inquired, his expression intent. "Strangulation, using what appears to be a silk scarf. Not her own, we've found nothing matching it among her possessions." "And the paper Swan?" I asked. Finch reached into his pocket and produced a small evidence envelope. From it he carefully extracted the item in question. It was indeed a swan, no larger than a matchbox, crafted with remarkable skill from white paper. Poirot accepted it with delicate fingers, examining it from all angles. His eyes narrowed slightly as he brought it closer to his nose, then returned it to the inspector. "Most interesting," he murmured. "There is, I think, a faint odour adhering to it." Finch nodded. Our police surgeon noticed the same, said it reminded him of the sea. "But, monsieur, we are by the sea," Poirot pointed out, with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Yes, but this was different somehow, more concentrated, if you take my meaning." After arranging to visit the scene of the crime the following morning, we dined in the hotel restaurant. Poirot, particular as always about his food, found fault with the soup, but pronounced the fish excellent. Throughout the meal I could see his mind was elsewhere, his gaze occasionally drifting to the darkened windows that reflected the dining room behind us. Later, as we retired to our rooms, I noticed Poirot carefully arranging his toilet articles on the dressing table with his usual precision, lining up each item at perfect right angles. "You know, Hastings," he said, adjusting a silver-backed hairbrush by a fraction of an inch, "there is something about this case that disturbs me profoundly." "The paper Swan?" I suggested. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it is the timing of it all." He gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the dark expanse of the English Channel. "There is a storm approaching, both figuratively and literally, I fear. This murder, it is but the beginning." I laughed nervously. "Surely you can't know that, Poirot?" He turned to me, his expression grave. "When one has encountered evil as often as I have, mon ami, one develops a certain sensitivity to its presence. This swan, it speaks of planning, of symbolism, of a design most carefully considered." He sighed. "No, I do not think Madame Blackwood will be the only victim in this affair." As I prepared for bed, I found myself oddly unsettled by his words. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, bringing with it the first spatters of rain against the window panes. Somewhere in the hotel, a door slammed with unexpected violence, making me start. Poirot had been right about the approaching storm. What neither of us yet realized was just how accurate his prediction would prove regarding the human tempest that was already gathering force in the seemingly peaceful town of Limehaven. Chapter 2. The Second Swan. The following morning dawned with that peculiar clarity that often follows a night of storm. The rain had ceased, leaving the air freshly scoured, and the sea a startling blue against the white cliffs. I found Poirot already at breakfast, meticulously dissecting a boiled egg with surgical precision. "Ah, Hastings, you have slept well despite the tempest." I admitted that the howling wind had kept me awake for a portion of the night. "I myself found it most disturbing," he said, with a slight frown. "Not only for the noise, but for what it may have concealed." Before I could inquire as to his meaning, Inspector Finch appeared in the dining-room doorway. His expression immediately alerted us that something was amiss. He strode rapidly to our table, declining Poirot's invitation to join us for coffee. "There's been another one," he said grimly, keeping his voice low. "A woman named Vivian Morton, found this morning by her gardener in her cottage about 2 miles out of town." Poirot's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "And was there—" "Yes," Finch nodded. "Another of those paper birds, placed right beside her, same as before." "Mon Dieu," murmured Poirot. "It is as I feared. The method of dispatch. Strangulation again. Same type of ligature as far as we can tell, though we're waiting on the doctor's report." We departed immediately for Seacrest Cottage, a charming thatch-roofed dwelling set among well-tended gardens. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered at the garden gate, held back by a constable who looked barely old enough to shave. He saluted smartly as Finch led us through. The body had been discovered on a garden bench partially concealed by a large rhododendron. By the time of our arrival, it had been removed to await the coroner, but the chalk outline remained alongside the discoloration of the wooden slats where Miss Morton had met her end. "The paper Swan?" inquired Poirot. Finch pointed to a small evidence marker. "It was there. We've already taken it in." Poirot knelt carefully, his immaculate trousers barely skimming the gravel path. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the bench, and inhaled deeply. "Again the same curious scent," he remarked. "Salt water, yes, but with something more. Something chemical, perhaps." He rose and began a methodical examination of the surrounding area, his eyes scanning the ground with intense concentration. I had observed this behavior many times before and knew better than to interrupt his thoughts with unnecessary questions. Inspector Finch, however, was less familiar with Poirot's methods. "Looking for footprints, Mr. Poirot? We've already made casts of several found in the soft soil by the hedge there." "No, no," Poirot replied without looking up. "The footprint, it tells us where someone has been, but often little else of value. I search for the anomaly, the thing that should not be where it is, or the thing that should be present but is not." After completing his examination of the garden, we proceeded into the cottage itself. It was a neat, comfortable home, tastefully furnished, with an obvious fondness for chintz and dried flowers. Poirot moved through the rooms with deliberate care, pausing longest in the small study where a writing desk stood beneath a window overlooking the sea. "Miss Morton lived alone?" he asked. "Yes," Finch confirmed. "She was a retired schoolteacher, moved here about 10 years ago according to neighbours." "And her age? 58 or thereabouts?" Poirot nodded thoughtfully as his gaze wandered to a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. He ran a gloved finger along the spines, pausing at intervals to examine a particular title. This curious behaviour continued for several minutes before he turned his attention to a small collection of framed photographs on a side table. "Did Miss Morton have family nearby?" I inquired. "A niece in London," Finch replied. "We've sent word, but she's travelling in Scotland. Won't be able to get here until tomorrow." "And the discovery of the body. Tell me precisely how this occurred," Poirot requested. "Her gardener, Thomas Wells, arrives every Thursday morning at 8:30. When Miss Morton didn't answer his knock, he went round to the garden to begin his work. That's when he found her on the bench." "This gardener, he has been in Miss Morton's employ for how long?" 5 years or so. Seems respectable enough. Works for several households in the area." "I should like to speak with him," Poirot said, "and also, if it is possible, with the proprietors of any shops that Miss Morton frequented. One must understand the victim's habits if one is to comprehend the mind of the killer." Our next several hours were spent in a succession of interviews. The gardener proved to be a weather-beaten man in his 60s who appeared genuinely distressed by the discovery of his employer's body. He could provide little useful information, having seen nothing unusual on his previous visit 4 days earlier. We then proceeded to the village high street, where Poirot insisted on visiting every establishment that Miss Morton might have patronized. At the small stationery shop, a nervous man with thinning hair recalled seeing her just 2 days prior. She bought her usual writing paper, he told us, twisting a pencil between his fingers. Always the same, cream linen with a deckled edge. Very particular about her stationery, was Miss Morton. Did you observe anyone paying undue attention to her? Anyone following her, perhaps? Poirot inquired. The shopkeeper hesitated. Well, not following exactly, but there was a fellow hanging about outside, walked with an odd sort of limp, never seen him before. This fragment of information caused Poirot's eyes to gleam with interest. This man, you could describe him? Tallish, wearing a dark coat, had his hat pulled down so I didn't see his face proper. Yeah, but the way he moved, sort of hitched up on one side, that was distinctive. As we left the shop, Poirot fell into a contemplative silence, which lasted until we returned to the hotel late that afternoon. There we found an agitated Inspector Finch awaiting us in the lobby. "There's something I should have mentioned earlier," he said, guiding us to a quiet corner. "We found a letter in Miss Morton's desk. It was unfinished. Apparently she was interrupted while writing it." He produced a sheet of cream writing paper, presumably from the very stationery the shopkeeper had mentioned. On it were written a few lines in a neat, precise hand. "My dear Sylvia, I was most disturbed by your letter referring to the tragic news about Eleanor. While we hadn't been in touch for many years, the manner of her passing has left me with a sense of profound disquiet. You may think me fanciful, but I cannot help wondering if there might be some connection to the events at W.E." The letter ended abruptly. Poirot studied it intently. "This Sylvia, she has been identified." "Sylvia Hargreaves," Finch nodded. "Lives in Eastbourne. We've already dispatched a constable to interview her." "Excellent," Poirot murmured, still examining the letter. "And this reference to events at W. You have thoughts on this?" Finch shook his head. "Could be anything, Wetherby, Westham, Worthing, or perhaps not a place at all," I suggested. "It might be a person or an organization." "Précisément, Hastings. We must keep our minds open to all possibilities." Poirot carefully returned the letter to Finch. "Inspector, I should be most grateful if you would arrange for all available information about both victims to be delivered to me here. School records, employment history, social connections, everything that might illuminate who these women were." After Finch had departed, Poirot and I dined in relative silence. He seemed preoccupied, his forehead furrowed in that way I knew, indicated intense mental activity. Only as we prepared to retire did he finally share a portion of his thoughts. "This case troubles me greatly, Hastings. 2 women, both strangled, both with the curious paper swan left as a signature. And now this unfinished letter hinting at some connection between them, despite the inspector's assertion that they were strangers." "Do you believe the reference to W is significant?" I asked. Poirot's expression remained grave. "In matters such as these, mon ami, there are no coincidences. Every detail has meaning. The paper swans, the scent of salt water, this mysterious W, the man with the distinctive walk. They are pieces of a puzzle that we must assemble with the utmost care." As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself reflecting on the peculiar sequence of events that had brought us to this quiet coastal town. Outside my window, the sea stretched dark and mysterious beneath a sky scattered with stars. Somewhere in Limehaven, I could not help but wonder, was a killer perhaps crafting another paper swan, selecting another victim? The thought sent an involuntary shiver down my spine as I extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, Poirot's words echoed in my mind. There are no coincidences. Chapter 3. Connecting Threads. The following days established a routine. Mornings spent examining reports and interviewing witnesses, afternoons dedicated to visiting locations connected to the victims, and evenings occupied with Poirot, arranging his notes in meticulous piles on the hotel room desk. On our third morning in Limehaven, Inspector Finch arrived at breakfast with a grim expression that now seemed permanently etched upon his features. "There's been another one," he announced without preamble. "Margaret Hale, an artist with a studio near the old pier, strangled just like the others." Poirot's face remained impassive, but I noticed his hand tighten slightly around his coffee cup. "And the paper swan?" "Present and accounted for," Finch confirmed. "We're keeping this out of the papers for now, but there's talk in the town. People are frightened." We departed immediately for the scene. Margaret Hale's studio occupied the upper floor of a converted boathouse overlooking the harbour. Large windows flooded the space with northern light, illuminating several unfinished canvases and a body-shaped void outlined in chalk on the wooden floor. She was discovered by a fellow artist who had an appointment to meet her this morning, Finch explained. While the inspector pointed out various details of the crime scene, Poirot moved about the studio with the deliberate precision I had observed so many times before. He examined the arrangement of paintbrushes in a ceramic jar, studied the half-completed painting on the easel, and spent a curious amount of time analyzing the victim's shoes, which had been placed neatly beneath a small bench. "Most interesting," he murmured, straightening up from his examination. "Tell me, Inspector, was anything unusual noted about the paper swan in this instance?" "As a matter of fact, yes," Finch replied, looking faintly surprised. "The doctor mentioned it seemed to be folded slightly differently from the others, not obvious to an untrained eye, but he'd examined the previous ones closely." Poirot nodded, a small smile of satisfaction playing about his lips. "Précisément. And the time of death?" "Between 9 and midnight last night, according to the preliminary examination." My friend glanced pointedly at a calendar hanging on the wall. "And today's date is—" "The 24th, I supplied, puzzled by the question. "And the date of Miss Morton's death?" "The 15th, said Finch, "and Madame Blackwood was discovered on—" "The 6th, Finch replied, his eyes widening. 9 days each time, exactly 9 days. "It appears our killer adheres to a schedule," Poirot observed. "This is most significant." After completing our examination of the studio, Poirot requested to see the victim's living quarters, which occupied a small cottage a short distance from the harbour. The modest home was filled with books, sketches, and collected objects that spoke of an artistic temperament. As at the previous crime scenes, Poirot paid special attention to the bookshelves, running his finger along the spines with an expression of intense concentration. In the bedroom, he paused before a small chest of drawers, opening each one methodically until he reached the bottom. "Ah," he said softly, extracting a faded photograph. "Perhaps you would be so good as to tell me, Inspector, if you recognize any of these individuals." The photograph showed a group of young women in outdated swimwear, posed on a rocky beach beneath imposing cliffs. Inspector Finch studied it carefully. "Can't say that I do, though this coastline looks familiar." He squinted at the image. "Could be Black Rock Cove, just a few miles from here." Poirot returned the photograph to the drawer with a thoughtful expression. I should very much like to keep this if possible. Upon returning to the hotel, we found a package awaiting Poirot at the front desk. He carried it to our shared sitting room and opened it with careful precision. "What is it?" I inquired, curiosity overcoming propriety. "Newspaper clippings," he replied, spreading several yellowed pages across the table. "I requested these from a colleague in London." I leaned forward to examine the headlines. Most appeared to reference an incident at an educational institution some 15 years previously, though Poirot gathered them together before I could read further details. "All in good time, mon ami," he said, noting my interest. "First, I must organize the facts as we have gathered them." With that, he began arranging his notes on the table in a pattern comprehensible only to himself. Small cards bearing cryptic notations were positioned and repositioned with mathematical precision, punctuated by occasional murmurs of "interesting" or "just as I suspected." After nearly an hour of this mysterious activity, during which I occupied myself with the newspaper, Poirot abruptly declared, "The little grey cells, Hastings, they begin to form a picture." "What sort of picture?" I inquired. "One that is still incomplete, but with distinct outlines emerging." He tapped a card thoughtfully. 3 women, all strangled, all with the paper Swan left as a signature. Each murder occurring exactly 9 days after the previous one. "Which means the next would be due on the 3rd of next month," Poirot finished, "unless we can prevent it." "Have you formed any theories as to the motive?" I asked. Poirot's fingers caressed his moustache. "Several, but it would be premature to speak of them. However, I will say this. I believe our answer lies in the past, a past that somehow connects our 3 victims despite their apparent lack of association." As darkness fell outside our window, Poirot continued his methodical arrangement of facts. I watched, equal parts fascinated and frustrated, as he occasionally consulted the newspaper clippings, making small notations in his precise handwriting. Though I had accompanied him on countless investigations, I never ceased to marvel at the ordered functioning of his mind, so different from my own more impulsive thought processes. Outside, the wind had risen again, driving sheets of rain against the window panes. The melancholy sound seemed an appropriate accompaniment to the grim business that had brought us to this seaside town, where 3 women now lay dead at the hands of a killer who communicated through paper swans. Chapter 4. The Survivor. The 9 days following Margaret Hale's murder passed with excruciating slowness. The town of Limehaven had transformed from a tranquil seaside retreat into a place of locked doors and suspicious glances. Women, particularly those living alone, had taken to travelling in pairs or groups, and a local security firm reported a brisk business in new door locks and window latches. Poirot spent these days in a state of concentrated activity that I found admirable, if somewhat puzzling. He conducted numerous telephone conversations behind closed doors, sent and received several telegrams, and twice disappeared for hours without explanation, returning with no comment as to his whereabouts. On the morning of October 3rd, the date we had calculated for the killer's next appearance, Poirot was uncharacteristically tense. His usually precise movements had an additional crispness, and he twice adjusted his bow tie when it was already perfectly straight. "We are close, Hastings," he remarked over breakfast. "I have arranged certain precautions with Inspector Finch, but—" He left the sentence unfinished, his brow furrowed. "You're worried the killer might strike again despite the precautions," I suggested. "It is more than that," he replied. "There is something in this case that continues to elude me, a missing connection. I sense it, but cannot yet see it clearly." Our suspenseful waiting ended just after noon, when Inspector Finch burst into the hotel dining room where we were taking luncheon. "There's been an attack," he announced, his voice low but urgent. "Caroline Shepherd lives in a cottage on Marlow Lane, but she's alive, managed to fight off her attacker." Poirot was on his feet instantly. "She saw the assailant." "Better than that," Finch replied with grim satisfaction. "She heard him speak. Says he had a pronounced stammer." We hurried to the local hospital, where Mrs. Shepherd had been taken as a precaution. We found her sitting up in bed, a bandage around her throat, and a determined expression on her handsome, middle-aged face. "Mrs. Shepherd," Poirot began, gently after introductions had been made, "I understand you have had a most distressing experience. If you feel able, perhaps you could recount the events to us." "Of course," she replied with surprising composure. "I was in my study, cataloguing some family papers. I heard a noise in the hallway, but thought it was just my cat. Then I felt hands around my throat from behind." She touched the bandage reflexively. "I teach self-defense classes at the Women's Institute, you know. I managed to break his hold and strike back. He wasn't expecting resistance." "Most impressive, madame," Poirot said with genuine admiration. "And you said this man, he spoke?" "Yes, just a few words. He said, 'You deserve this,' a very pronounced stammer, and then he fled when I reached for the poker by the fireplace." "You saw his face?" Inspector Finch asked eagerly. She shook her head. "He wore a mask, a sort of stocking pulled over his head, but he was tall on the thin side, wore a dark coat." "And did you notice anything else? Perhaps a particular scent?" Poirot inquired. Mrs. Shepherd considered this. "Now that you mention it, there was a smell like the sea, but stronger, as if he'd been swimming in it." Poirot nodded, seemingly satisfied with this confirmation. After a few more questions, we left Mrs. Shepherd to rest, with a constable posted outside her door as a precaution. "We should visit her home," Poirot announced as we left the hospital. "There may be evidence the attacker left behind in his haste." Caroline Shepherd's cottage was a neat, comfortable dwelling surrounded by a well-tended garden. The front hall showed signs of struggle, a small table overturned, a vase shattered on the floor. While Inspector Finch examined the garden for footprints, Poirot made his way methodically through the house. As in previous victims' homes, he showed particular interest in the bookshelves, studying them with an intensity that struck me as peculiar. "Poirot," I ventured, "I don't understand your fascination with these women's reading habits." He smiled faintly. "Books, mon ami, often reveal more about their owners than photographs or personal documents. They tell us what ideas shaped the mind, what dreams occupied the imagination." Suddenly he reached out and removed a slim volume from the shelf. "Ah," he murmured, "most interesting." He slipped the book into his pocket with a deftness that surprised me. "Shouldn't you inform Inspector Finch about that?" I asked, somewhat alarmed. "All in good time, Hastings. First, I must confirm a theory. Later that evening, back in our hotel suite, I attempted to draw out my friend's thoughts on the case. Poirot had arranged his collection of index cards on the table and was studying them with fierce concentration. "Surely the man with the stammer is our killer," I suggested. "The shopkeeper mentioned a man with a distinctive walk watching Vivian Morton. Perhaps the limp and stammer are connected to some physical injury." "Perhaps," Poirot replied, neither confirming nor denying my theory. "And this attack on Mrs. Shepherd follows the 9-day pattern exactly," I continued. "It must be the same person." "The timing is certainly suggestive," he conceded, rearranging several cards with precise movements. "But what's the connection between the victims?" I persisted. "They seem to have nothing in common. A widow, a retired teacher, an artist, and now this Mrs. Shepherd who teaches self-defense." "Ah, but there is always a connection, Hastings." "Always." Poirot tapped one of his cards thoughtfully. "Consider, what brings people together in life? family, profession, geography, education, shared experiences. You think they might have attended school together? I ventured, recalling the newspaper clippings about an educational institution. Instead of answering directly, Poirot gathered his notes into a neat pile. Tomorrow, mon ami, I must make several inquiries by telephone, and I believe we should pay a visit to a place called Blackrock Cove. I retired to bed that night with my mind swirling with possibilities. The mystery seemed both clearer and more opaque. We had a description of sorts of our killer, yet the motive remained shrouded in darkness. In the adjoining room I could hear Poirot moving about, the soft sounds of drawers opening and closing, papers being shuffled. I knew from experience that he would continue working late into the night, his orderly mind arranging and rearranging facts until patterns emerged from chaos. Outside, a full moon cast silver light across the restless sea, illuminating the white cliffs that guarded this coastline. Somewhere in the sleeping town, perhaps a killer was raging against his failure, or perhaps plotting his next attempt. The thought sent a chill through me as I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. Chapter 5. The Academy by the Sea. The following morning, Poirot announced his intentions over breakfast with characteristic precision. Today, mon ami, we shall visit two locations of significance. First, Blackrock Cove, which Inspector Finch identified in the photograph. Second, a place that I believe holds the key to our mystery, the former Wavecrest Academy. Wavecrest Academy? I repeated. Is that the W mentioned in Vivian Morton's unfinished letter? Précisément. Poirot nodded, delicately dabbing his lips with a napkin. There was once a prestigious school for young ladies, situated on the cliffs just north of town. It closed its doors some years ago, but I believe it is there that the roots of our present tragedy were planted. He produced a slim, leather-bound book from his pocket, the volume he had taken from Caroline Shepherd's bookshelf. This, Hastings, is a yearbook from that very institution dated 15 years ago. He opened it to a marked page showing a group photograph of young women in formal school uniforms. With his characteristic precision, Poirot pointed to 4 faces in the image. Eleanor Blackwood, then a teacher of literature, Vivian Morton, mathematics instructor, Margaret Hale, art mistress, and here, his finger moved to a younger face, Caroline Shepherd, then Caroline Winters, a student in her final year. I stared at the photograph in astonishment. So they did know each other, but why would Mrs. Shepherd deny any connection to the other victims? Ah, that is indeed one of our most interesting questions, Poirot replied, closing the book carefully. Perhaps our visit today will illuminate this curiosity. We set out in a hired motorcar, following the coastal road north. Blackrock Cove proved to be a small, secluded beach, accessible only by a steep path down the cliffs. We stood at the viewpoint above, gazing down at the rocky shore where waves crashed with hypnotic rhythm. A dangerous spot for swimming, I remarked, noting the turbulent waters. Indeed, Poirot agreed, his eyes scanning the landscape thoughtfully. And yet, according to the yearbook, the young ladies of Wavecrest were brought here annually for a traditional seaside photograph. He consulted his pocket watch. We must proceed to the academy. I have arranged for the caretaker to meet us there. A few miles further along the coast road, we came upon an imposing Victorian structure perched dramatically on the cliffside. Even in its abandoned state, Wavecrest Academy commanded respect, a 3-story stone building with tall windows that would have provided spectacular views of the sea. We were met at the gates by an elderly man who introduced himself as Mr. Finney, caretaker of the property since before its closure. Not much to look after these days, he commented as he unlocked the heavy front doors. Place has been empty for 12 years, Owners keep talking about turning it into a hotel, but nothing ever comes of it. The interior was shrouded in dust sheets, the grand entrance hall echoing with our footsteps as we crossed the marble floor. Despite years of neglect, the building retained a ghost of its former elegance. "What led to the school's closure?" Poirot inquired, as we followed Mr. Finney up a sweeping staircase. "Financial troubles, officially," the caretaker replied, though the incident didn't help matters. "Incident?" I prompted, catching Poirot's eye. "Nasty business," Mr. Finney shook his head. "Happened in my son's time as groundskeeper, not mine. Group of girls played a cruel joke on Thomas Matthews, the assistant groundskeeper's boy, left him badly injured. School hushed it up, but parents started withdrawing their daughters anyway." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "This Thomas Matthews, what became of him?" "Poor lad was never the same. Developed a terrible stammer after the accident. Couldn't keep his position, of course, not with that impediment. His father took him away. Heard they moved to Portsmouth or thereabouts." We continued our tour through empty classrooms and dormitories. In what had once been the headmistress's office, Poirot requested to see any school records that might have remained. "Most were taken when the school closed," Mr. Finney informed us, "but there's a storeroom in the cellar with boxes of papers no one bothered to claim." The cellar was damp and dimly lit, lined with dusty cardboard boxes. Mr. Finney left us to our search, claiming the stairs troubled his knees. For nearly an hour, Poirot and I sifted through forgotten administrative documents, student essays, and faculty meeting minutes. "Ah," Poirot suddenly exclaimed, carefully extracting a folder from a box labelled Disciplinary Actions. "Here we have it, Hastings, the official account of the incident involving Thomas Matthews." I read over his shoulder as he scanned the typewritten report. "A regrettable prank involving 6 students who lured Matthews, 17, to the boathouse under false pretenses. The subsequent accident resulted in significant injuries requiring hospitalization. The students involved have been identified as..." The list of names had been redacted with black ink, but at the bottom of the page a handwritten note added, "Matthews family compensated and matter closed. TM expelled for inappropriate communication with female students. Official reason for incident." "Expelled?" I exclaimed, "but I thought he was the victim." "It appears the school preferred to place the blame on the young man rather than acknowledge the wrongdoing of its students," Poirot observed grimly. "A not uncommon practice in such institutions, wishing to preserve their reputation." We continued our search until Poirot found a personnel file for Thomas Matthews' father, which included a forwarding address in Portsmouth. He copied this information carefully into his notebook. As we emerged from the imposing building into the afternoon light, Poirot stood for a moment, gazing out over the sea. "What happened in that boathouse, Poirot?" I asked. "I suspect a cruel joke that went too far," he replied. "The sort of thing that leaves permanent scars, both physical and psychological." "And you believe Thomas Matthews is seeking revenge after all these years, targeting the women who were present that day?" Instead of answering directly, Poirot consulted his watch. "We must return to Limehaven immediately. I have asked Inspector Finch to make inquiries about Thomas Matthews in Portsmouth." The drive back was conducted largely in silence, Poirot lost in contemplation while I wrestled with the emerging picture. The pattern seemed clear: a man traumatized in youth, returning to exact revenge on those responsible for his suffering. We found Inspector Finch waiting in our hotel suite, his expression unusually grave. "I've had a response from the Portsmouth police about your Thomas Matthews," he announced, without preamble. "Seems you're a bit too late to arrest him." "Ah," Poirot nodded, as if expecting this. "He is deceased?" "Committed suicide exactly 1 year ago," Finch confirmed. jumped from the ferry into the channel, left a note saying he couldn't bear the memories any longer. I stared at them both in disbelief. But if Matthews is dead, who is killing these women? Who attacked Mrs. Shepherd? Poirot sank into a chair, his expression inscrutable. That, mon ami, is the question we must now answer. The pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed to be falling into place so neatly, were suddenly scattered again. As darkness fell over Limehaven, I found myself wondering just how many layers of deception remained to be peeled away before we would discover the truth behind the Paper Swan murders. Chapter 6. The Sister's Shadow. If not Thomas Matthews, then who? This question dominated my thoughts as I accompanied Poirot to breakfast the following morning. The revelation of Matthews' suicide had upset the neat theory that had been forming in my mind. Poirot, however, appeared remarkably unperturbed. He attacked his boiled egg with precise movements, his expression serene. "Have you formed a new theory?" I inquired, unable to contain my curiosity. "Not new, mon ami," he replied, meticulously salting his egg. "Modified, perhaps. The human element in this case is most complex, most psychological." Before I could press for details, Inspector Finch joined us, sliding into a chair with the weary air of a man who had slept little. "I've been making further inquiries about Thomas Matthews," he announced in a low voice. "He had a sister, Diana Matthews. Still lives locally, works as a librarian at the Limehaven Public Library." Poirot's eyes lit with interest. "A librarian? Most appropriate." "Appropriate?" I echoed, puzzled. "Books, Hastings." Always in this case we returned to books. He turned to Finch. "I should very much like to meet this Mademoiselle Matthews." The Limehaven Library occupied a red-brick Victorian building near the town centre. Miss Diana Matthews proved to be a slender woman of about 35, with unremarkable features and light brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. She received us in a small office lined with reference volumes. "I understand you're investigating the recent incidents," she said, her voice soft but controlled. "Though I can't imagine how I might help." "We are following several lines of inquiry, mademoiselle," Poirot replied smoothly. "One concerns your late brother, Thomas." At the mention of her brother, a shadow seemed to cross her face, but she maintained her composure. "Thomas has been gone for a year. I failed to see how he could be relevant to current events." "Indirectly, perhaps," Poirot suggested. "He was once employed at Wavecrest Academy, I believe." "As a boy?" she nodded. "He helped our father, who was the groundskeeper. It ended badly." "The accident?" Poirot prompted. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on her desk, tightened almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate cruelty. Those girls lured him to the boathouse, locked him inside, and then—" She broke off, fighting for control. "They set off fireworks just outside. Thomas had always been terrified of loud noises. He panicked, tried to escape, and fell through the rotted floorboards onto the rocks below." "Most distressing," Poirot murmured sympathetically. "He nearly died," she continued, her voice steadying. "And when he recovered physically, he had the stammer. The school dismissed our father, claiming negligence for the boathouse's condition. They gave us a small settlement, but insisted we leave immediately. Thomas was never the same after that." "And the girls responsible were never punished?" I asked. "The school protected them," she replied bitterly. "Wealthy families, prestigious connections. What was a groundskeeper's son compared to that?" We asked a few more questions about her work and her life in Limehaven, to which she gave polite but unrevealing answers. Throughout the interview I detected nothing particularly suspicious in her manner, only the lingering pain of one who had witnessed a loved one's suffering. As we departed, Poirot surprised me by announcing a sudden change of plans. "I must make certain telephone calls," he declared. "Meanwhile, Hastings, I have an important task for you. Please go to this address." He handed me a slip of paper, "and make inquiries about Mademoiselle Matthews among her neighbours. Be discreet, but thorough." The address led me to a modest block of flats overlooking the harbour. By presenting myself as a potential tenant interested in the neighbourhood, I managed to engage several residents in conversation. Most described Diana Matthews as quiet and private, though one elderly woman proved more forthcoming. "Keeps to herself mostly," she told me over tea in her cluttered sitting room, "but ever so clever with her hands, makes the most beautiful paper crafts you've ever seen." "Paper crafts?" I echoed, my interest immediately piqued. "Origami, they call it, Japanese art. She gave me a lovely paper flower last Christmas. Said she learned it from her brother. It was their special hobby growing up. He made the most exquisite pieces, according to Diana. Swans were his specialty, apparently." I thanked her and hurried back to the hotel, eager to share this revelation with Poirot. I found him in our suite, surrounded by papers and telegrams, a yearbook open on the table before him. "Poirot, the most extraordinary thing. Diana Matthews is skilled at origami, paper folding. Her brother apparently specialized in making swans." "Ah," he nodded, seeming unsurprised. "This confirms what I had begun to suspect, and your other impressions of the lady's reputation among her neighbours. Quiet, keeps to herself, nothing suspicious or unusual reported. The quiet ones, Hastings, often harbour the deepest currents beneath their still waters." He gestured to the chair opposite. "Observe this photograph." It was the Wavecrest Academy yearbook, open to a page showing what appeared to be a drama club performance. Poirot pointed to a figure at the edge of the group, a younger Diana Matthews in a stage costume. "Note that she was present at the school, not as a student, but in some auxiliary capacity, perhaps assisting her father and brother. And yet, in the official records of the incident, her name is never mentioned." His finger moved to another face in the photograph, a young woman whose features had been methodically scratched out with what must have been a sharp implement. "Most interesting, is it not?" he murmured. "The face obliterated, yet the surrounding image untouched, a deliberate act, not of random vandalism, but of targeted hatred." Before I could comment, there was a knock at the door. Inspector Finch entered, looking troubled. "You asked me to make arrangements for tomorrow evening," he said to Poirot. "The Grand Atlantic's private dining room is reserved for 7 o'clock. But are you certain about this? Gathering everyone together could be dangerous if our killer is among them." "It is necessary," Poirot replied firmly. "And now I have another request. Please assign an officer to discreetly observe the library. If Mademoiselle Matthews leaves her post, I wish to know immediately." After Finch departed, Poirot revealed his plan to gather all potential suspects and witnesses at the hotel the following evening. When I expressed concern about placing Caroline Shepherd in potential danger, he waved away my objections. "Certain precautions will be taken," he assured me cryptically. "Now, I suggest you rest, mon ami. Tomorrow will be a most eventful day." That evening, as I prepared for dinner, I found myself studying my reflection in the mirror with unusual intensity. The case had taken an unexpected turn, and I sensed we were approaching its denouement. Yet crucial pieces still seemed missing from the puzzle. Outside my window, the lights of Limehaven twinkled against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that peaceful-looking town lurked a killer who left paper swans as calling cards, a killer who might soon strike again unless Poirot's plan succeeded in bringing them to justice. Chapter 7. Paper Memories. The morning of Poirot's planned gathering dawned with unseasonable warmth, as though summer had briefly returned to challenge autumn's dominance. After breakfast, Poirot spent several hours making telephone calls and writing notes in his precise handwriting, his concentration unbroken even when I attempted conversation. Just before noon, our quiet preparations were interrupted by Inspector Finch, who burst into our suite with uncharacteristic agitation. "She's gone!" he announced without preamble. Poirot looked up calmly. "Who precisely has gone, Inspector?" "Caroline Shepherd. The constable I posted outside her cottage reports that she left early this morning, supposedly to visit her sister in Eastbourne, but I've telephoned the sister. Mrs. Shepherd never arrived." "Most interesting," Poirot murmured, though his expression suggested this development was not entirely unexpected. "And you have searched her residence?" "Thoroughly. We found this on her writing desk." Finch produced a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be a partially completed paper swan. "It looks like the others, except it's unfinished." Poirot examined it through the plastic with intense concentration. "The folding technique, it is different in certain details from the previous examples. Most significant." "You think the killer took her?" I asked, alarmed at this new development. "It is one possibility," Poirot conceded, "though not, I think, the most likely one. Inspector, I suggest you focus your search on locations associated with Wavecrest Academy, particularly the old boathouse, if it still stands." "The boathouse was condemned years ago after the academy closed," Finch replied. "But the structure remains, too expensive to demolish safely, given its position on the cliffs." "Then that is where you should concentrate your efforts," Poirot advised. "Meanwhile, Hastings and I have an appointment at the public library." Upon our arrival, we were informed that Miss Matthews had called in sick that morning, her first absence in over 3 years, according to the head librarian. This news seemed to confirm something in Poirot's mind, for he nodded with the satisfaction of one whose theories are being validated. "We require access to the local history section," he informed the librarian, "particularly any materials relating to Wavecrest Academy." We were led to a secluded corner of the building where local archives were stored in glass-fronted cabinets. With the librarian's permission, Poirot began a methodical examination of newspaper clippings, school programs, and photographs relating to the academy. "What exactly are we looking for?" I whispered, conscious of the library's hushed atmosphere. "Connections, mon ami. Always connections." His gloved fingers delicately turned the pages of a faded scrapbook. "Ah, observe." He had found a newspaper article dating from 15 years earlier, reporting on a production of The Tempest at Wavecrest Academy. The accompanying photograph showed a group of students in costume, including a young woman identified as Caroline Winters, now Shepherd, in the role of Miranda. In the background, barely visible, was a figure I recognized as a younger Diana Matthews, listed as stage assistant. "They knew each other," I breathed. "Mrs. Shepherd must have been one of the students involved in the incident with Thomas." "Précisément," Poirot nodded. "And now we must see what else Mademoiselle Matthews has been researching in her professional capacity." With the assistance of a bemused junior librarian, we gained access to the records of materials recently accessed by staff. Diana Matthews, it appeared, had made extensive use of the newspaper archives, particularly issues covering the past year. "The date of her brother's suicide," Poirot noted, examining the log. "She requested all coverage of the incident repeatedly, and here," his finger traced down the list, "requests for biographical information on each of our victims made weeks before their deaths." "Surely that's conclusive evidence," I suggested. "She was researching her targets." "It is suggestive, certainly, but not conclusive. A good defense lawyer would argue it was natural professional curiosity from a librarian." Our next stop was Diana Matthews' desk in the reference department. While the junior librarian kept watch, Poirot quickly and deftly examined the drawers. In the bottom one, concealed beneath a stack of catalogues, he discovered a folder containing newspaper clippings about each of the murder victims, alongside several about her brother's suicide. "She has been collecting them," I whispered, "building some sort of macabre archive." "A memory book," Poirot nodded. "But observe the curious fact, Hastings. These clippings about her brother's death have been altered." Looking more closely, I could see that certain words and phrases had been neatly cut out from the articles. But why remove words from newspaper stories about her own brother? I wondered. "Perhaps," Poirot suggested, replacing the folder exactly as he had found it, "to use them for another purpose, the classic anonymous message composed of words cut from newspapers." We returned to the hotel, where Poirot immediately placed a call to Scotland Yard, requesting to speak with his old friend, Inspector Japp. Their conversation was brief, but intense, conducted in such low tones that I could catch only fragments. When he hung up, Poirot's expression was grave. "Japp will arrive on the evening train," he informed me. "Just in time for our gathering. Now, we must prepare for tonight's revelations." "Do you expect Diana Matthews to attend?" I asked. "Surely if she's responsible for the murders and possibly for Mrs. Shepherd's disappearance, she wouldn't risk coming." "On the contrary, mon ami, if I have read her character correctly, she will not be able to resist. The desire to witness the culmination of one's grand design is a powerful motivator." Throughout the afternoon, Poirot remained closeted in his bedroom, emerging only once to take another telephone call. I occupied myself with the newspaper, though my mind was too preoccupied with the case to focus on international affairs or cricket scores. At 6:30, as I was dressing for dinner, I noticed that Poirot's door stood slightly ajar. Peering in, I discovered the room empty, with no sign of my friend. On his pillow lay a single sheet of hotel stationery bearing the words, "Have gone to complete the collection. Do not worry, all will be explained tonight." This cryptic message did little to allay my concerns. As darkness fell over Limehaven and the time for the gathering approached, I found myself standing at the window, scanning the promenade below for any sign of Poirot's distinctive figure. The sea beyond was growing restless, whitecaps visible even in the gathering darkness. A fitting backdrop, I thought, for what promised to be a dramatic evening. Chapter 8. The Final Swan. The Grand Atlantic's private dining room had been arranged according to Poirot's precise instructions. A long table occupied the centre, surrounded by chairs for all the invited parties. At one end, a smaller table held a collection of items I recognized from the investigation: photographs, the Wavecrest Academy yearbook, and several paper swans preserved in evidence bags. By 7 o'clock, the room had begun to fill with a curious assembly. Inspector Finch arrived first, accompanied by Inspector Japp, who had travelled from London at Poirot's request. They were followed by Mr. Finney, the caretaker of Wavecrest Academy, and several neighbours of the victims. The head librarian from Limehaven Public Library entered looking distinctly uncomfortable, and to my surprise, Diana Matthews herself arrived promptly at 7:05, her unremarkable features composed in an expression of polite curiosity. By 7:15, only two people were conspicuous by their absence: Poirot himself and Caroline Shepherd. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as minutes ticked by with no sign of my friend. Inspector Japp checked his watch repeatedly, while Finch paced near the windows overlooking the darkened sea. At precisely 7:30, the door opened to reveal Poirot, immaculate as always, his moustache perfectly waxed. But it was his companion who drew all eyes, Caroline Shepherd, apparently unharmed, and showing no signs of the ordeal her disappearance had suggested. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot announced, gesturing for silence, as murmurs of surprise rippled through the room. I thank you for your patience. Now we may begin." He guided Mrs. Shepherd to a chair and took his position at the head of the table. His eyes moved deliberately around the assembled company, pausing fractionally longer on Diana Matthews, who returned his gaze with remarkable composure. "I have invited you here," Poirot began, "because each of you is connected, directly or indirectly, to what the newspapers have called the Paper Swan murders. 3 women are dead: Eleanor Blackwood, Vivian Morton, and Margaret Hale. A 4th, Madame Shepherd, survived an apparent attack. The only connection between these women seemed to be the paper swans left at each crime scene, until we discovered that all 4 had been associated with Wavecrest Academy 15 years ago." He picked up the yearbook from the small table. 3 as teachers, 1 as a student. But there was another connection, was there not, Madame Shepherd? His penetrating gaze fixed on Caroline. She shifted slightly in her seat. "I'm not sure what you mean, Monsieur Poirot." "Then allow me to refresh your memory. 15 years ago, a young man named Thomas Matthews was seriously injured at the Academy's boathouse. The official record states that several students lured him there as part of a cruel prank involving fireworks. He fell through rotted floorboards onto rocks below, sustaining injuries that left him with a permanent stammer." Poirot's finger traced the edge of the yearbook. "Among those students was a young woman named Caroline Winters, now Shepherd. Also present were Eleanor Blackwood, Vivian Morton, and Margaret Hale, not as perpetrators, but as the teachers who helped conceal the identities of the guilty students and arranged for Thomas Matthews and his family to be dismissed." A murmur ran through the assembled guests. Mrs. Shepherd's face remained impressively impassive. "Thomas Matthews never recovered fully from this trauma," Poirot continued. "1 year ago he took his own life. Shortly thereafter, a series of murders began, each victim connected to that long-ago incident, each marked with a paper swan, Thomas's signature craft." He turned his attention to Diana Matthews, who sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. "It would seem obvious that someone was avenging Thomas Matthews. His sister, perhaps? A devoted sister who had watched her brother suffer for 15 years before surrendering to despair." Diana Matthews met his gaze without flinching. "If you're accusing me, Monsieur Poirot, I suggest you produce your evidence." "Ah, but that is precisely the difficulty," Poirot replied. "The evidence points in contradictory directions. Consider, paper swans left at each murder scene, yet with subtle differences in folding technique. A killer who apparently stammers, yet the real Thomas Matthews is deceased. And most curious of all," he turned suddenly to Caroline Shepherd, "a supposed victim who shows no signs of the attack she reported." Poirot moved to stand directly before Mrs. Shepherd. "There was no intruder in your home that day, was there, madam? You created the evidence yourself, the overturned table, the staged signs of struggle. You even placed a half-finished swan on your desk to be found later." Inspector Finch leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Poirot?" "I am suggesting, Inspector, that Madame Shepherd has been playing a most dangerous game. Having participated in the cruel prank that ruined Thomas Matthews's life, and later learning of his suicide, she conceived a plan both brilliant and terrible. She would murder the others involved in the incident, leaving paper swans as a signature, swans she had learned to fold, though never quite perfectly, having observed Thomas's technique years ago." "But why would she attack herself?" Finch objected. "To divert suspicion, of course, and to provide a description of the supposed killer, a man with a stammer clearly meant to suggest Thomas Matthews, a perfect scapegoat, being already dead and unable to defend himself." Caroline Shepherd's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. I was nearly killed. Were you? Poirot raised an eyebrow. The marks on your throat were self-inflicted, superficial at best. You arranged your own disappearance today to create additional drama and concern. You can't prove any of this, she insisted, though her voice had lost its certainty. Can I not? Poirot gestured to Japp, who produced a folder. Inspector Japp has brought the results of a most thorough investigation. Your finances show substantial withdrawals corresponding to the days before each murder. Your car was observed near Miss Hale's studio on the night of her death. And most damning of all, he turned to Diana Matthews. Mademoiselle, would you please tell us what you discovered in your research about these murders? Diana's voice was steady. I realized the pattern after the second murder. Both victims had been at Wavecrest when my brother was injured. I began investigating, afraid that someone was using Thomas's memory to justify murder. When I discovered the paper swans, I knew someone was deliberately invoking him. And you documented your findings, Poirot nodded, creating a file which Madame Shepherd discovered when she broke into your home last week. She then used newspaper clippings from your research to create the anonymous notes she claimed to have received as threats. Caroline Shepherd stood abruptly. This is all circumstantial. You have no proof I killed anyone. On the contrary, Poirot replied calmly. When you disappeared this morning, you took a very particular book from your shelf, a collection of literary quotations. Throughout this investigation, I noticed that each victim's home contained the same book with certain pages marked. These selected quotations matched exactly the arrangement of objects at each crime scene. He produced the book in question. This edition contains your fingerprints not only on the cover but on the specific pages corresponding to each murder scene. Most damning of all, it contains a handwritten list of names. The 6 students involved in the incident with Thomas Matthews. 3 names are crossed out. Caroline Shepherd's face had gone white. Her gaze darted to the door, but Inspector Finch was already moving to block her path. Why? Diana Matthews asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas never blamed you. In his suicide note, he even forgave everyone involved. Caroline's laugh was brittle. Forgave us? How noble of him! Do you know what that incident cost me? I was expelled quietly. My parents paid handsomely for the school's discretion. My entire future was derailed because of a stupid prank that went wrong. For 15 years I've lived with the consequences while building a new life. Then I read about his suicide and realized he escaped. He found peace while I was still paying the price. As Inspector Finch placed handcuffs on Caroline Shepherd's wrists, Poirot turned to Diana Matthews. Mademoiselle, I must apologize for allowing suspicion to fall upon you, even temporarily. It was necessary to draw out the truth. She nodded slowly. I understand. In a way, I'm relieved. Thomas can rest now, knowing the truth has been revealed. Later that evening, as Poirot and I sat in the hotel lounge, I ventured to ask how he had first suspected Caroline Shepherd. The paper swans, mon ami, he replied, sipping his sirop de menthe. Thomas Matthews was an artist with paper. His creations would have been perfect. Yet the swans left at the crime scenes showed small inconsistencies, the work of someone who had observed but never mastered the technique. And then there was the matter of the books. Always the same volume on each victim's shelf, always carefully positioned. It suggested someone with a literary mind constructing murder scenes to match specific quotations. He gazed thoughtfully into his glass. The human capacity for hatred and for self-justification is boundless, Hastings. Caroline Shepherd convinced herself she was the true victim, that her actions were a form of justice. Such is the distorting lens of bitterness when nurtured over many years. Outside the hotel windows, the autumn wind had risen again, driving rain against the glass in rhythmic patterns. In the morning, we would return to London, leaving behind the paper swans and the tangled web of vengeance they had represented. Yet I knew that, like all of Poirot's cases, this one would remain with me. A reminder of how the past reaches forward through time, folding and refolding like paper in practiced hands until it assumes a shape both beautiful and deadly. Thanks for joining us for The Paper Swan Murders. Did you suspect Caroline Shepherd was behind it all, or were you just as surprised as Captain Hastings when Poirot revealed the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Poirot and Hastings, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Poirot's wisdom. It is the brain, the little grey cells on which one must rely. One must seek the truth within, not without. This is Alfie signing off from Café Stories.